Vectoring sketches can be tough, but it doesn't have to be. By sketching with the end vector design in mind, you can actually make the whole process a lot simpler and a lot easier for you later down the line during the vector process when you take it into either Adobe Illustrator or Affinity Design, just to name a couple of design programs. Let's start with an overview of a few methods. The first one is when you're vectoring to use the pen tool. And this is generally what I use. This is what I'm going to be going through today. So I sketch with the pen tool in mind, and you'll see how I do that. But another method is to use vector brushes. Now, with vector brushes, my personal experience is you have a little less control, but it does allow you to trace over normal sketch lines a lot easier. Somebody who does a great job of this is Fernando Nunes, and his work looks pretty dope. So now we've had a really quick overview of a couple of the methods. Let's just move straight on to how I do it, how I'm going to be teaching you to make this process a lot easier, hopefully, when it comes to the vectoring process. First, let's head onto the iPad. In fact, before we jump on the iPad, just to address all of this mess around me on this overlay, I am using my Twitch overlay. I don't know what to use for YouTube right now, so just bear with me on this one. First things first, let's just have a quick look at me putting together my base sketch. This is before I even consider vector lines. This is just to get a basis down. Now we're still in Procreate, but what we want to do is we want to reduce the opacity of that base sketch layer, so that we can create a layer on top of it and start to sketch in thicker lines, which are a little bit more suitable for vectoring around, for tracing around with the pen tool. As I mentioned, there's a few ways you can do vector illustration, but the way I'm teaching you, the way I use most often, is to trace around lines with the pen tool. This is what works best for that. As you can see from that first line I've drawn in, I've tapered it at each end. That's because it's a standalone line. It doesn't connect to anything, and it leaves a nice clean finish doing it that way. And you'll notice with the second line I draw in there, because it connects, I do not taper it at the connecting end. I also don't taper it at the finishing end, and that's because I know it's going to connect to another line once I've drawn that in, because of the base sketch that I've layered underneath. Obviously, line width and weight is going to change as you go to different parts of the illustration. Here, as I move on to the teeth, I'm going to make it a lot less thick, the line width that is, just so that you can actually see the teeth. Otherwise, they'd be completely filled in. It's worth noting that it pays off to really take your time with this sometimes as well. Not every stroke is going to work, and you might have to hit that undo button a few times. Obviously, if you're sketching on paper, you don't really have that option. But if you're sketching lightly, which I would encourage to do if you're doing this on paper, then you can always erase it with an eraser. But yeah, take your time, because this doesn't have to be perfect, but you want to get a good indication of how you want these lines to look, so that there's less guesswork when you do export the finished sketch into Adobe Illustrator. And on the back of that, if you happen to be working on something for a client, then if your final sketch is as close to the final vectored piece as possible, visual wise, then there's going to be no surprises for your client. It's going to give a real good indication of what your client can come to expect with a finished vectored product. So once you have your main outline done and you have some of your features filled in, for example here it's the eyes and the nose of the skull, then you can start looking at putting some detail lines in. Now, following on from the same method of thought as the outlines, with the detail lines, you want to be tapering off any of the line ends that aren't connecting, because it just adds a nice clean finish. This is, of course, completely dependent on your style, but it is how I like to approach finishing line ends, and it does make it a lot easier to trace around with the pen tool. How crazy you go with these details is completely up to you. I like to add in a fair amount of detail, but not too much that it doesn't leave scope for the block shadowing and colouring, which we'll cover shortly. But sort of even minor details can really help add depth to the illustration. And again, it just gives you a good idea of where you want things to go when it comes to tracing around in Adobe Illustrator. Now, in Procreate, you don't have the blend tool like you do in Adobe Illustrator, but this doesn't mean you shouldn't add details in that might lend well to that feature. You don't have to add in quite as many lines, but you can give an indication that you want a selection of detail lines that maybe grow in height or decline, gain a little bit of extra weight as they move up the line. You can always apply the blend tool in Illustrator. This is just to give an indication and basically let your future self know that that's what you want to go there. It's all an experimental game. It's all a game of playing. So just have a look and see what looks good to you. You'll see that I, every now and again, might put in a couple of lines, 2 to 3. This illustration in particular, I don't put too many in, but some of my other illustrations, I've marked in quite a few lines, and it's lended itself quite nicely, the blend tool that is, to adding in those details when it comes to vectoring. Now, once you've got to a stage where you feel comfortable and happy with the outline and the detail lines you've put in, then I like to move on to the block coloring. The reason I do this is, you probably guessed it by now, it's to remove any guesswork later down the line, or at least eliminate as much guesswork as possible. Now, with block coloring, I tend to use grays. I decide on color in the vectoring process. So for the sketch stage, I just use grays as if I was shading with a pencil. So I'll choose a nice mid-gray to fill everything in with. And then I'll choose a lighter gray to block in the highlights and a darker gray to block in the shadows. I'll show you how I approach that here. It's an easy process, and it just allows for quick application of highlights and shadows when it comes to creating that vector version of your sketch. That is, of course, one of the plus sides of working digitally. You can, with traditional media like pencil and paper, you can create a nice, fairly even shading over an illustration, and then you can shade a little bit heavier where you want the shadows to be, and you can even use the eraser of where you want the highlights to be, or you could just block in your highlights first and shade around those sections so that they appear as highlights without you having to use the eraser. They are options that you can go for if you're using traditional media, but obviously with digital, you have the plus side of varying whether you have a lighter gray or a darker gray. Of course, if you have color pencils, maybe you could use those, and it might have a similar effect. So just to recap, you want to do your outlines first, your nice thick outlines which are easy to trace around with a pen tool in Illustrator. Then you'll want to move on to your detail lines, which are probably going to be a little bit thinner than your outlines, but still shaped enough so that it's easy to trace around when you get to Adobe Illustrator. And then you're going to move on to your block coloring. And as you can see, this gives you a nice basis to take across into Adobe Illustrator. So for now, let's just export this. If you're using traditional media, you can scan it in. Let's get it into Illustrator, and I'll quickly give an example of how this makes it so much easier to trace around with the pen tool. I'll be covering a more detailed look at the pen tool in a future video, so this will just be a quick look. And here's the finished vector piece. I went ahead and vectored it all together, and just so I could show you what the end result looked like after the sketch. Well, that leads us to the end of the video. I hope what I just went through you found helpful. If you have any questions, please do pop them in the comments. Always happy to help, always happy to answer. I always check regularly. Thanks for watching, guys. If you wanted to catch any of my other content, post most of my designs up on Instagram, and I live stream regularly on Twitch under the same name. So guys, until next time, take care.